talk today. The talk is Education, Enhancement and the Pursuit of the Good. So I'm just going to ask start with a question here and ask you, what do you see? Perhaps you see fragmented images, human figures with some Chinese characters here and there. I don't know what your screens are like, how it's transmitting. Here is a reconstruction of that image. Now, this seems to be an instructional document, an early educational text, we might say. It's known as the Dalian 2, a painted scroll dating back to 168 BC, which was discovered in 1973 as an archaeological site in Changsha, China. The scroll shows figures demonstrating Dalian exercises, which are precursors to Tai Chi and Qigong. It is thought to be the earliest physical exercise chart in the world, although that might be debated. If the author intended to influence the reader's physical, mental, and perhaps spiritual condition, then I think we are justified in calling it an educational text, a precursor to a textbook. The text might have been intended to treat ailments, but it seems to be directed towards improving, as we might say, general health and well-being. In other words, it provides demonstrations of actions directed towards treatment as well as enhancement. If the boundary between treatment and enhancement is here blurred, it is because the boundary is itself a product of particular contexts. The division between treatment and enhancement is fundamental to how we justify and police certain forms and means of improvement. Attempts to understand the ethics of human enhancement can be illuminated by drawing parallels to the ethics of influence more generally, specifically in relation to my own field of research, which is education. Here then is a matrix of human improvement. A spectrum between treatment and enhancement runs across the top. Therapy illustrating treatment and education as enhancement, both of which we could consider conventional forms of improvement. Along the bottom, I illustrate unconventional improvements from nootropics, cognitive enhancing drugs, which can be considered both treatment and enhancement, to blood doping, an illicit method of improving athletic performance by boosting the ability of the blood to bring oxygen to the muscles. So it's the bottom right-hand corner here that calls for the most considered ethical account. While advanced technological or biomedical treatments are hardly without ethical considerations, biomedical enhancements raise greater ethical problems, partly because they are deemed unnecessary for health and life. If one accepts that the distinction between treatment and enhancement is unclear, so is the distinction between conventional and unconventional forms of enhancement. And it is this latter distinction that is most pertinent to what I want to say this evening. So I'm going to focus on the concepts belonging to the right-hand side of the screen. How should we understand the relations between conventional forms of human improvement, such as education, and unconventional forms of enhancement like blood doping? My ultimate aspiration would be to find criteria for determining good kinds of enhancement, irrespective of the vagaries of convention. And although I admit I won't quite realize this today, I hope to offer some useful reflections in that general direction. So then, allow me to begin with a general definition of education. I want to define education as an intention to improve someone else's relation to something. And now this is most often illustrated through the figure of the educational triangle. What makes this triangle educational is this: the educator's intention to influence the student's relation to something. This means that the activity of the educator is restricted to attempts to influence. This positions the educational improvement itself, in other words, the learning that takes place, within the activities of the student. My account of the ethics of education focuses on the educator's intentions rather than outcomes. While the ethics of education is a broad topic, of course, I'd like to summarize it as follows, and it's on the screen. Who can justifiably attempt to influence whom, for what purpose, and by which means? So let me illustrate this with an example which hopefully many of you recognize. Obi-Wan Kenobi intends to influence Luke Skywalker's relation to the Force. Obi-Wan hopes that his influences on Luke amounts to an improvement by bringing about an increase in skills, an expansion of his horizons, and a deepening of his self-understanding. But it is Luke who must then do the learning. The intentions of Obi-Wan to influence Luke involve ethical considerations. Is developing the Force a good thing? Are Obi-Wan's methods, for instance, occasional bits of pain, justified? As we later discover from the backstory of Darth Vader, not all attempts to influence a student's relation to the Force are for the good. It's not clear whose interests are served by the Emperor's efforts to improve Anakin Skywalker's relation to the Force. Describing intended influence is one thing, justifying it is quite another. A feature of this relational definition of education is that the educator is different from the student. But self-education, of course, is not uncommon. Where one seeks to improve oneself, the educator and the student are the same. This bears upon some of the ethical considerations, since the basic educational problem of heteronymous influence is avoided. Similarly, the ethics of using nootropics to improve my own memory are different to those of encouraging or coercing someone else to use them. Without wishing to delve too deeply into educational theory or Star Wars fandom, it's worth noting that the content of education, in this case an understanding of the Force, needs to be represented in some form in order to be communicated. Mediating concepts through spoken language is one thing, but educational mediation often takes place through written forms. Forms of mediation provide a consistent link between education and technology. From books to blackboards to tablets, technological mediations are a common feature of education. Not only do technologies represent content, they also seem to have a more direct influence on human formation itself. Bernard Stiegler has developed this thought by arguing that we only become modern human beings by virtue of certain technological prostheses that accompany human becoming, in particular the technologies of writing. Technical mediations, what he calls exteriorizations, allow humans to extend and transmit their experiences and their memories. Recalling Plato's Phaedrus, Stiegler regards technical exteriorizations with some ambivalence. Writing or computer databases both enhance and diminish human memory. The ambivalence that accompanies technical mediations reflects a wider issue. How do we decide what kinds of mediation are good? How do we decide if a textbook mediation, for instance, is appropriate? When ought children to be allowed to use calculators, dictionaries, search engines, and so on? When we represent educational content, we make pedagogical judgments. When, how, and why to use a particular mediation to good effect. Such judgments are governed by an understanding of pedagogy, an understanding that underpins the design of educational experiences. The ethical considerations raised by educational design are complex, though the principal ethical issues share parallels with the ethics of unconventional enhancement. A fundamental ethical consideration of education is who decides. Who decides that a proposed enhancement, for instance, developing a taste for green peas or not, in this case, or being able to recall the periodic table, who decides that these are enhancements? Because the educator is often not the same person as the student, we don't justify educational intentions only by appeal to liberal ideals of self-determination. To be a student is often to accept the influence of another, which also means allowing someone else's notion of the good life to inform us. Part of being a good educator is about soliciting implicit or explicit consent from the student in order that the attempts to influence are received positively. Nevertheless, the educational condition that someone must decide for someone else that a particular enhancement is good is generally accepted. Although this creates an uneasy tension, this is mitigated by the belief that educational influence supports the development of the student's autonomy. But this gives rise to the educational paradox. In order to become independent or autonomous, the child is typically initiated into a relation of dependency. The child depends on heteronymous influence in order to become autonomous. And whether that dependency is ever finally overcome is a philosophical problem beyond my scope today. The point here is that educational influence is often justified in terms of an imperative to supporting the autonomy of the child, which itself is thought to contribute to the good. Not only is enhancing autonomy desirable, it is also often regarded as obligatory. For instance, we normally think we are morally obliged to teach children to read, partly because reading supports the autonomy of the child and thereby contributes to the good life. Appeals to the development of autonomy or the good are generally persuasive in the context of conventional enhancement, and yet such appeals are contested when it comes to unconventional means. Why isn't the belief in the good of nootropics acceptable while belief in good schooling is? Sorry, the belief in the good of schooling is. More pointedly, the obligation to send children to school, which is by no means risk-free, and I know we have a certain amount of sentimental feeling about this just now by the fact that our children maybe aren't going to school, but anyway, that's another story. So the obligation to send children to school seems inconsistent with the obligation to avoid nootropics unless they are designated as treatment. As Alan Buchanan has put it, we have, quote, strong intuitive aversion to the idea of normal, healthy children being required to take drugs to improve cognitive performance. When it comes to the technological enhancement of human beings, certain inhibiting concepts are remarkably persistent, one such concept being the natural. In his declaration of transhumanist values, Nick Bostrom provocatively claims that there is nothing wrong about tampering with nature. The idea of hubris is rejected. Now, to some educationalists, this seems far from commonsensical because it places humans in a supreme position above nature. I suspect that Bostrom means to deconstruct the concept of nature rather than position the human above it. Elsewhere, Bostrom and Sandberg discuss how concerns about enhancement are predicated on vague sensibilities about what is natural or given. They address a widespread concern that unconventional enhancements, such as nootropic drugs, gene therapy, neural implants, are thought to encourage a kind of hyperagency where humans are effectively playing God. They point out that appeals to the category of the given do not provide criteria for determining which changes reflect an excess of human agency and which are for the good. How are we to determine what is given if there is no uninterpreted access to it? Stiegler, for instance, argues that the development of human nature is coeval with the development of early tools. That anthropogenesis is bound up with technogenesis, making the concept of a given human nature seem like a convenient fiction. Have we ever been anything other than cyborgs? Now, Buchanan directs his criticism at the concept of nature as a reference point in education. His problem is that the concept of human nature arbitrarily restricts us to conventional forms and means of human becoming. For Buchanan, the possibility of biomedical cognitive enhancements undercuts one historically important strand of progressive education, the Rousseauian idea that, in the quotes on the screen there, the proper task of education is to facilitate the actualization of the individual's natural potential, where natural potential is implicitly assumed to be fixed. He goes on, I suspect that Rousseau's advocacy of this view rested on two assumptions: that the natural is wholly good and that an individual's nature is unalterable. When educators speak of natural education, this need not imply that the potential of the student is fixed by nature. Can't education have a normative direction without being entirely fixed? I want to show that the key significance of the organic framing of education is to do with the processes of education, namely that they entail human growth. Understanding that education is about designing conditions for human growth might give us a context for recognizing the direction of education without fixing to an unalterable and therefore, in principle, uneducable human nature. So then what does natural education mean? What kinds of technologies can be a part of natural education? Now, the concept of natural education, and I'm just going to outline three different ideas here, and I'm sure there are others. The concept of natural education is often used to emphasize the popular idea of schooling outdoors, perhaps in parks or forests, interacting with organic objects, sticks, stones, plants, animals, and so on, avoiding an overly technologically framed experience within school. A second concept would view the nature of natural education as referring to the idea that the child has a nature to which the good educator pays attention. The nature and disposition of the child, for instance, a natural talent, provide the substance which can be shaped or sculpted by the educator, whether or not this takes place in a so-called natural environment. And now this leads me to my third conception, or really it's an emphasis, third emphasis within the concept of natural education, which is that the idea that the educational process is one of growth which can only be undertaken by the student. Here, natural education is child-centered because it acknowledges the primary activity of the student in the educational process. Organic metaphors are so widespread in education: cultivation, growth, maturation, development, because it speaks to this idea, the organic nature of the process. Organisms appear to have an inner principle of self-generation and motion to which educators pay attention. In the terms of this metaphor, the educator is more of a gardener than sculptor, whose role is, as John Dewey says, to create the conditions for growth. The idea of creating conditions for growth emphasizes the designed nature of educational environments and experiences. Whether a schoolroom or a virtual learning environment, the space is designed to optimize the growth of students. Do you recognize this? This is a design space. Perhaps some of you do. It's a Montessori classroom where objects are quite deliberately, quite intentionally arranged in particular ways for particular kinds of experience. So not only is the space designed, but so are experiences. They're curated. The principles of classroom and curriculum design are many and varied, but like any designed object or experience, they attempt to bring about certain outcomes. So I want to emphasize two things here: the design of the educational experience by the educator and the activity of the student in their own growth. The interaction between design and growth can be interestingly juxtaposed with a notion popular among technological design, namely frictionlessness. So I just want to change gear for a minute and think about frictionless humanization. Published in 2000, Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think, argued that ideal design should make the user experience effortless. Krug's argument resonated with the emergence of frictionless design, which has become the aspiration for agile technological disruptors. Netflix just works. The Uber just arrives. You can just ask Google, and don't even get me started on Zoom. Frictionless technology is unencumbering. Reflecting Albert Borgman's notion of technological availability, frictionlessness renders functionality instantaneous, ubiquitous, safe, and easy. Posting on Facebook epitomizes this virtue. But availability seems to have a golden mean. Too much of it has unintended effects, especially when scaled by AI. The effects of frictionless design of social media have been explored by critics who point to the bad habits that are formed. Jaron Lanier, for instance, has talked about the tendency of it to bring out our inner troll. It may be that these formative influences are to do with how we are engaged. Immersive engagement seems to undermine reflection. And perhaps we're realizing the promise of Krug's design principles that is being made to not think. Now, recently, some designers have acknowledged problems with the frictionless design paradigm, urging different forms of user engagement. This is not simply about making interfaces more cumbersome, which sounds kind of absurd. Rather, it is, to quote Steve Seltzer, intentionally adding the kinds of friction that lead to self-reflection, self-discovery, and personal growth. Carl DeSalvo puts this in stronger terms, calling for adversarial design, which provokes and engages the political. Frictionless design might be said to enhance the user experience, but it is not educational. The very idea of frictionless learning, perhaps appealing to the paradigm of the ubiquitous learner, should make us pause. And I will pause to have a sip. And so you can get the joke. Doesn't any kind of change or growth require friction? While educators often seek to make the educational process engaging, entertaining, pleasing, organic growth entails some form of movement which is unsettling, involving a degree of disruption. For this reason, education calls for a kind of friction that fosters reflection, discovery, and growth. But what kind of friction will do this? Now, there's no easy answer, but arriving at this question, I think, establishes a few educational principles. The design of educational experiences differs significantly from frictionless availability of information accessible through ubiquitous networked media. Mass availability of information disorients and drowns. The design of educational experiences, on the other hand, involves the curation of the particular, selection and simplification in order to draw attention to something, to precipitate growth in a particular direction. Now, this only describes the activity of the educator in design. What of students' growth? Because the learning or growth that takes place depends upon the activity of the student, the intentions of the educator only go so far. In the educational context, friction acts upon the student to stimulate growth. Friction disrupts and so is in some sense unsettling. A notion which corresponds with the educational principle that for change to happen, there must be disruption or alienation from the comfort of one's settled perspectives or habits. Consider this simple pedagogical moment, and this is just a short quotation from some phenomenology of education, you might say. When my answer is wrong, I know it immediately because my teacher, Per, looks at me with this particular humorous glance and says, after just a little pause, yes. Then I understand that he wants me to give the question a second thought. He leans back comfortably and waits. Excuse me. Knowing when to hold back cannot be underestimated. But how do we know that the teacher who holds back from providing an answer introduces the right kind of friction? Friction that unsettles in a way that creates conditions for growth. Or in more explicitly educational terms, how do we know if a particular educational experience will result in learning? And relating this to the questions of the ethics of enhancement, how do we know if the growth intended by this kind of friction or education is in fact an enhancement? So basically there are two persistent questions at play here. Firstly, the relation between the educational intention and the outcome. And secondly, whether the intentions or outcomes are actually good. So I'm going to tackle the first question briefly. What is the relation between educational intention and outcome? It might seem commonsensical to say that outcomes ought to be the result of intentions. If I teach something, I intend it to be learned. The sciences of learning seek to eliminate the gap between intentions and outcomes through the development of what is known as the behavioral objectives model, in which objectives and outcomes are explicit and visible. And of course, it is not so simple. In The Beautiful Risk of Education, Gert Biester, for instance, argues that it is a misconception to see education as a predictable relation between input and outcome, in which we can eliminate the unexpected or the risky. To construe education without risk is to miss something of its nature. We cannot know that our educational efforts will result in the intended learning. We cannot entirely design or control growth. While the gap between intention and outcome might be understood as a weakness or risk, it can also be reframed as the space for growth. Now, the more difficult question here is the second one. How do we decide whether intentions are actually good or not? What concept of human becoming informs the direction of education without fixing it on some conventional notion of human nature? For centuries, the concept of the good towards which human beings ought to aspire was imagined through various formulations of the imago Dei, the image of God, from the early church to the Enlightenment. For much of Christendom, the formation of human beings in the widest sense, what is known as Bildung, was conceived as a process of realizing the self through the image of God or Christ, of striving towards God-likeness, and even in some theologically rash formulations of becoming God. The religious framing of human becoming was reformulated in secular terms during the Enlightenment with Wilhelm von Humboldt's classic definition of Bildung. And here's a section. It is the ultimate task of our existence to achieve as much substance as possible for the concept of humanity in our person, both during the span of our life and beyond it, through the traces we leave by means of our vital activity. An inner principle of growth, then, seems to inform Bildung. But is the conception of the good, described here in terms of an increase of substance to which education may strive, really clear? Carsten Kenkles suggests not. And here's a quote from Kenkles. Far from having a clear image of what the human should strive for, that is godlikeness, Humboldt sets the goal of all human aspirations as the richest possible life, to enhance the general idea of what it could mean to be human. The idea of humanity, the concept of being human, is not pre-given, is not already known or spelled out. While this means we are not beholden to a conventional notion of human nature, we are left with a problem. How do we know which kinds of striving are enriching or enhancing? So to explore this, I want to take a brief journey through the concept of the Bildungsreise, the educational journey, which is both literally and metaphorically an educational journey. For Humboldt, the inner transformations of Bildung take place by means of an outer encounter with the world. Through alienation from the familiar, the self can change, grow, and transform. But which elements of the world make a transformative encounter possible? One that not only changes, but enhances. What can help us to achieve as much substance as possible? What objects or experiences enable the interplay between receptivity and self-activity? Which Bildungsreise, which educational journey, can take us out of ourselves in order to return expanded and enhanced? Is it the other of reading Confucius, of contemplating the artistic productions of Frida Kahlo, of travel to the Indian subcontinent, of nootropic drugs or neural implants? What kinds of experience count as positively alienating or disrupting in the sense that Humboldt has in mind? Inspired by Goethe's literal Bildungsreise, the idealization of this Italian journey, later reformulated in Goethe's diaries, Humboldt sees the ideal encounter with the other in rather conventional, perhaps, if not exactly familiar terms, through an encounter with the classical forms of Greece and Rome. Now, whether this travel is literal or metaphorical, a movement takes place in which we depart from the known and habitual in order to encounter the strange, the unexpected, the unbidden. A brief interpretation of this suggests that we find, at least in Humboldt, the concept of disruption or of alienation too attached to a particular classical image of the other, one we might now call a rather conventional form of alienation, not exactly an opening to the unbidden, but to a standard projection of the other. And it's certainly true that what might be conventional to us today may not have been so around the turn of the 19th century. In our efforts to determine what kind of change are for the good, convention never seems far away. But I want to emphasize the opening to the unexpected or unbidden over the ways in which that opening is filled. Because of the gap between intentions and outcomes in both conventional and unconventional enhancement, we should approach both forms with a speculative attitude and a degree of humility. From an educational perspective, the presence of such a gap is not a technical issue to be resolved, but reveals something of the fundamental structure of educational enhancement. That any kind of change or transformation entails a disruption or alienation of the existing structure in order to create conditions for growth. Thus far, I've emphasized the design of educational experiences which foster human growth, a kind of growth that you could associate with self-transcendence. But now I want to shift the focus from growth of the individual student to the intergenerational space of social growth, to the gap between the older and younger generation. And this shift will allow us to redeploy the metaphor of growth in the political context, in which the gap that opens up between the intentions of educators and the growth of students creates the possibility for another kind of interruption, an interruption of the social order of the world, or what we might call social transformation. In her essay, The Crisis of Education, Hannah Arendt says, hope always hangs on the new, which every generation brings. But precisely because we can base our hope only on this, we destroy everything if we so try to control the new that we, the old, can dictate how it will look. Indeed, just as the educator cannot control or even fully anticipate the growth undertaken by the student, so the older generation cannot fully anticipate changes brought on by the arrival of the younger. Rather, the older generation can, indeed must, bear witness to the world as it is and then let go, hoping that in doing so, conditions are created in which the new may arrive in the form of social renewal. This describes the gap between what educators do and what students take forward, and ties Arendt's interest in education with her broader analysis of freedom enabled through natality. Education involves creating conditions in which the new may come into the world. Conditions that might also be described in terms of openness. Openness to the mystery, the unbidden, the other, as well as self-transcendence, or the alienation of the literal or metaphorical educational journey. So I want to now briefly contrast this with the transhuman agenda, which I think resists the new in this way that Arendt defines it. So I would not be the first to question the view that the technologically mediated transhuman quest for immortality would be an enhancement. My critique of transhumanism rests on educational insight. The transhuman quest for continued life, in which the old seeks to sustain itself indefinitely, seems to oppose the intergenerational renewal through education described by Arendt. Firstly, though, there is the basic problem of resources. The old must make space for the new by the renewal of life through death. Although this could perhaps be solved by extraterrestrial colonization, or through digitization or uploading. However, there is an educational principle at stake here, that human life is constituted through the creative tension between those coming into the world, the young, and those going out, the old. The necessity of education correlates with the necessity for growth, interruption of the existing order of things, and the renewal of the world. So rather than being regarded as revolutionary or radical, transhumanism looks fundamentally and ruinously conservative. It seeks to sustain what is as it is, preventing the new, resisting growth. Transhumanists sometimes berate those who are hesitant about the scale and scope of technological change as bioconservative, though the irony is that it may be the transhuman community itself that is the most conservative of all, by failing to see how the preservation of the old is an affront to the ongoing renewal that sustains us, sustains us all. The renewal, this renewal is not a case of the new entirely displacing the old, as a cult of youth might have it. By no means does this jettison tradition and the past. In order for children to arrive in the world, they must, says Arendt, be introduced to it. And here lies the legitimate but the circumscribed authority of educators, that by showing the world, they are able to take responsibility for it while letting the forces of growth and renewal remake it in ways that cannot be controlled. Despite Arendt's ambivalence towards religion, perhaps this interpretation of new life through only through a kind of death could be read Christologically. In any case, Arendt ends her Crisis of Education essay with the following appeal to love. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token save it from that ruin which, except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and the young, would be inevitable. And education too is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. For Arendt, this renewal is not realized in a techno-utopia in which we may exist indefinitely, but a common world in which the old order is in constant transformative renewal. And this means that convention and tradition provide the ground for representing the world to the young, who are then able to engage in invention and transformation. This is a state of balance between old and new, between past and future, a balance between the temporal conditions that make education both necessary and possible. So I'm just going to briefly conclude. Attempts to control the future, either through the design of educational experiences with fixed outcomes, or through the quest for unlimited and unending individual human existence, can present problems. By seeking to determine the outcome of learning, the educator might stunt the vital forces of human growth. By seeking unlimited existence, the transhumanist might restrict the possibilities for social and cultural renewal. Although extinguishing vitality from culture or from the student is deadly, measured intentions for the future are inescapable. Skilled educators exercise their ethical and practical understanding in order to discern how far to act and when to hold back. Holding back entails an attitude of humility. It allows new life and transformative growth to take hold. What this notion of holding back or letting learn means for unconventional human enhancement remains, I hate to admit, to be worked out. It suggests a kind of patience in which we don't try to push ahead and control, but to intend and to patiently observe. Thank you so much for listening.